And while we're doing that, I'm going to share my screen briefly. Everyone see that?
Pollinator Week continues.
It sure does. So I just wanted to remind everyone that it is still Pollinator Week, and this is sort of our last programming, official programming for the week, but a number of other organizations that are part of the Pollinator Network are hosting events. And so I just want to draw your attention to those. If you're in Northampton, there's a Perma Blitz happening on Saturday. There's an in-person talk by Amherst naturalist John Root, also on Saturday. So if you're in Russell, Massachusetts or nearby, that will be happening at the public library. There's also going to be a wonderful garden tour on Cape Cod. And you can find those events through our website if you go to the event gallery. And I'll also in a moment sort of chat out the link to that event gallery. So I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to that. And I'll put that back up at the end. Okay. Kate, do you see any more people who need to be admitted from the waiting room?
You know, it looks like it's quiet for a minute.
Okay, great. Cool. All right. Thank you all so much for coming. This is our first event in our summer seminar series. So thank you so much for being here for the kickoff presentation. I am so happy to have Dr. Kate LeCroy joining us tonight. Kate is at the University of Virginia in the Department of Environmental Sciences, and she recently defended her PhD. I got to see that defense. It was one of the best defenses I've ever seen. Kate's research is made possible by a citizen science partnership with over 200 Virginians across the Commonwealth to monitor mason bees. With this monitoring program, Kate has been able to assess wild bee health and diversity. These efforts have elucidated mechanisms as to why native mason bee species are declining in the mid-Atlantic United States, which is a story involving invasive mason bees, non-native fungal infections, and climate. In collecting data for her dissertation, Kate has closely mentored undergraduates, and many undergraduates, I should add, and she's given over 50 presentations to academic and public audiences. Kate is a Jefferson Fellow at UVA and is the recipient of a National Science Foundation Graduate Fellowship. In her free time, Kate enjoys going on walks with her husband, Riley, and their dog, Maggie. And I also just want to mention that I know Kate actually from when she was an undergraduate doing research at the experimental station where I was doing research as a graduate student, which feels like a million years ago now. And it's just a wonderful thing to have known her as an undergraduate and then all these years later invite Dr. LeCroy to present her research. So thank you so much, Kate, for being here. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. And fun fact, that was 10 years ago when I was an undergraduate.
No.
Isn't that wild?
Wow.
So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Can everybody see my screen all right? Great. Well, thank you again for your time here. And I will begin right now. So thanks again for inviting me, Rosemary. Today I wanted to share my work with mason bees and also look at the research I've done and share more info about mason bees in Virginia or the mid-Atlantic United States. But I think there'll be some interesting things that we can all learn, including for folks in Massachusetts too. So pollination, as we know, is the movement of pollen from male plant structures to receptive female plant structures. And nearly 90% of all known plant species on Earth are flowering plants. And most of those are pollinated by bees. And the pollination of fruits, nuts, and vegetables is valued at $15 billion per year to the US economy and $170 billion per year globally. Both managed and wild bees contribute substantially to crop pollination. And there's been a growing scientific and public concern over bee populations worldwide, which has generated a considerable number of research projects, conservation programs, and public campaigns to save the bees. And in the case of awareness and conservation programming, these hopefully offer some evidence-based solutions to enhance either bee food resources or nesting resources. And with research programs, we hope to understand mechanisms by which bee populations are languishing, such as what evidence do we have for bee declines. So what evidence do we have? Well, there has been a really great body of research that has been made possible by honeybee researchers and bumblebee researchers. So the European honeybee Apis mellifera, as well as bumblebees in the genus Bombus. And these 4 drivers of bee populations have been found to be habitat destruction, introduced species, use of pesticides, and parasites and pathogens. And we know this, like I said, due to honeybee and bumblebee research, but we're very curious about all of the broader diversity of bees as well. There's a much larger diversity of bees in the ways that they operate in the world. And I wanted to stop and just illustrate that a little bit as to what I'm talking about. So bees of the world are incredibly diverse. We know we've got around 20,000 species of bees, and they navigate the world around us in a variety of ways, including, for instance, nesting. We've got, for instance, bee species that nest in the ground, so they're ground nesting bees. We also have cavity nesting bees that nest in hollow cavities all in nature. And then we do have other bees that are excavators. So maybe like the carpenter bees on your front porch, where they will excavate into your front porch, that they make their own cavities. Another way in which bees operate in different ways around the world is with their behavioral strategies. So most bee species are solitary, meaning that there's no colony of highly related individuals, no division of labor between anything like queen bees and worker bees. It's usually every female bee for itself, laying eggs and providing food for its offspring. Other bees are social bees, much like the common perception of bees we have, with colonies ruled by queens, with worker bees. And then we've also got species that don't play by these rules at all. They're brood parasites, and they benefit by not having to make a nest of their own or provision food for their offspring. So there's a variety of ways to be a bee and operate as a bee in the bee world. So going back to those 4 drivers of bee, 4 stressors of bee populations, we have around 4,000 species of wild bees in North America alone, and evaluating the impacts of these stressors on wild bees is very important. And I want to look at the outcomes of introduced species and parasites and pathogens on native and wild bee species. So, and the group of bees in particular I work with are mason bees. So mason bees are solitary bees. They're in the family Megachalidae, and they nest in hollow cavities found in nature. We have around 350 species of mason bees worldwide, and that's the genus Osmia. And they can nest in hollow twigs, woodpecker holes, snail shells, pine cones, you name it. You might find them there. Or even, my favorite one was a garden hose. Like if you look in the garden hose and there's like a little divot, you might find mason bees in there. I've seen them there. So anywhere that's hollow, they might nest. And temperature is really important for the mason bee life cycle. In Virginia, right around in the spring, in mid or early April, the adult mason bees will emerge from their cavities, and they will fly, they'll mate, and then the females will begin foraging for pollen resources and nectar, and they will begin nesting. And the way that they make their nests are by creating these large loaves of pollen that each loaf of pollen can have 5 to 10 million grains of pollen. And then there's some regurgitated nectar that keeps it together. And then they'll lay an egg on that loaf, and they give each offspring their own bedroom. So they earn their nickname Mason, not by joining a secret society, but by creating these partitions of mud or chewed leaves between each loaf and egg. And then that egg will hatch. It will consume a lot of that pollen provision. And then that larva will begin to spin a cocoon, and it's a silky cocoon. And they will pupate inside that cocoon and stay inside that cocoon all during the winter. And inside that cocoon, they'll morph into an adult and stay as an adult inside that cocoon all through the winter. So they overwinter as adults, and then they emerge as adults the next spring. And in my region, we have a variety of mason bee species, and some of them are native mason bee species, and others are non-native mason bee species. And we have around 20 or so species in the Mid-Atlantic. In particular, Osmia cornifrons was introduced intentionally by the US Department of Agriculture from Japan for orchard pollination in the 60s and 70s. And then we also have Osmia taurus. Osmia taurus is also from Asia. We don't know how it got here, but we first recorded it in West Virginia around 2002. And the beginning of my work was understanding if there are any changes since introduction of Osmia taurus, and seeing if our native species or non-native species have any changes in their status of how we're monitoring them. So I did this with a large group of collaborators, and especially those from University of Delaware and the US Geological Survey. And the way that we evaluated the trends in mason bees population increases or declines was that we used pan trapping. So pan trapping is the idea where you get a solo cup or a party cup, and you paint them attractive colors to bees, and you space them equally apart, fill it with some kind of preservative trapping solution, and it will passively catch flying insects that fly by. And the idea is that you can process and identify those species, and you can answer questions about how these catch abundances may change over space and time. And I was able to utilize 3 data sets here. And this covered Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware, and the District of Columbia. And the data sets were collected with community science participants. So they put these in their backyards, their front yards, any property that they were given permission to do so. And this data was not possible without them. The resulting data set was from 2003 to 2017. So this is a long amount of, a long time series for bee monitoring data that we are able to have with pan trapping. And we did filter out some data. So any bad weather days, we needed to remove that from the data set. We had to remove sampling events that didn't include all the colors that we wanted for bees. And eventually we were able to use nearly 6,000 specimens of Osmia that we could include in our analyses. And this analysis took into account a lot of other things, such as how many solo cups did we put out, how long were they out for, as well as the disparate spatial structure across all of these states in the District of Columbia. But what I want to do now is show you the results. And you can check out this paper. It's open access on scientific reports in the bottom right of the slide. But basically, I'll show you this graph on the dotted line. If there's anything above this dotted line, that means that that species is increasing in catch abundance over every year on average. And anything below that dotted line represents a decline. And we were able to analyze 6 native mason bee species and 2 non-native mason bee species. And we found that all of our native mason bee species are in significant yearly declines. And the non-native Osmia taurus is significantly increasing on average each year, about 16% increase per year. So this is concerning. And one of the important things I wanted to talk about for the rest of our time is looking at potential drivers of population trajectories. So one is that I have 4, so I'm going to try and go through all 4. But the first one I want to highlight here is that there's competition among native and non-native mason bees. And bee species can compete with each other for food and nesting resources. And if we were to think about what bee species might be competing with each other the most strongly, it would be this one right here, Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard bee. And I'll show a picture in just a minute, but they have a lot in common with the non-native mason bees. They're the most taxonomically similar. They utilize mud, whereas for their nesting walls, whereas all the other mason bees use chewed leaves. They are similarly sized, whereas other mason bees are much smaller or larger. And they come out in Virginia at the very same time. And these are the 3 species again. But what we actually see is that there are a lot of other native species that are also experiencing declines. So perhaps this isn't the whole story, that maybe there are some other things beyond direct competition that could be influencing such a genus-wide decline. So the next 3 categories, or the next 3 drivers I want to talk about, were made possible with community or citizen scientists. And the important thing here is that I was able to recruit community scientists with the use of, with the help of the Virginia Master Naturalist Program. So I'm sure y'all also have some local programming that does continuing education and volunteer work projects and conservation projects. And I highly recommend that you tune in and get connected to these groups. And I was able to recruit a great number of folks here. And I was able to get over 200 participants in different sites all over Virginia here over 3 years. And these are just the greatest people in the world. I feel like I've got just a lot of folks that are very interested in my research, and I'm interested in how they're collecting data. And the things that I gave them to help monitor include bee hotels. So these are entomologists sometimes call them trap nests, but they're just as similar to the popular type of bee hotels where you can conveniently observe nesting behavior. They're thought to enhance available nest sites and that they could be reusable. And so I got into a little bit of woodworking, and I was able to create these nests. And when a mason bee occupies it, this is what you see. And the last thing that the female mason bee did after creating her nest, she sealed a plug of mud. But before that, she created these nest structures, which include like a mud wall. You can see there's some fecal matter, and there's a leftover pollen sometimes, which I find interesting. And then there's this cocoon with the adult bee inside. And this is our unit of data here. So what we find, we could find adult mason bees inside. So we'll open them up and identify who they are. Other units of data could be, and this is foreshadowing, that maybe the bee has succumbed to a fungal disease, or also some can have parasitic wasps that are inside here that that have actually taken over the inside of that cell for that nest. So it's kind of, you might not know what you get when you open a cocoon. So to start with the second driver here, we're thinking about habitat and climate favoring Osmiotaurus, so that non-native species that's been proliferating quite a lot. And in Japan, Osmiotaurus and Osmiocornifrons are found, they don't have the same distribution. So Osmiotaurus is found on the islands of Japan of Kyushu, Shikoku, Honshu, and Hokkaido. Whereas Osmiocornifrons remains restricted to the Central Highland, Honshu, and Hokkaido. And they're not on the south or the coasts. So that's pretty interesting when we're thinking about these climate zones where these bees might occur. And if we look at Virginia, we have some similar coping climate classification zones. And it made us curious. Na Young Lee, as an undergraduate student, and I were curious about the climate zones potentially showing different distributions of Osmiocornifrons and Osmiotaurus in Virginia too, in the Mid-Atlantic. So we sought to evaluate this by looking at 2 years of our data. And at these sites, we extracted from GIS, some software, we utilized 30-year climate normals. So a climate normal is basically an average of a weather variable over a long amount of time. So this is 30 years. So what we took was the average wintertime temperature, the annual precipitation, as well as elevation at that site. And we know that all of these things do impact mason bees and how they're distributed in an area, and from previous research from other researchers. And what we found here is you'll see these dots, and the red dots signify Osmiotaurus is present at that site, so the one that's been increasing quite a lot. And then the yellow dots indicate that Osmiocornifrons, which was introduced in the 70s from Japan, that they're found there. And what we do notice is first that Osmiotaurus, it's not predicted by any of the variables that we analyzed. They're not significant predictors. But for Osmiocornifrons, we do see that mean wintertime temperature was a significant predictor for Osmiocornifrons. So with every increase in wintertime, and every increase in degrees Celsius of wintertime temperature, you're 67% less likely to find Osmiocornifrons at that site. So the warmer winters, you're less likely to find cornifrons. And we think that's really interesting because with the key takeaway here is Osmiotaurus is not limited by the same climatic factors that is hampering the previously introduced cornifrons from expanding and becoming invasive, perhaps the way Osmiotaurus is invasive. And we think further work should evaluate how far Osmiotaurus could spread in North America, especially in the future, in terms of future climate change scenarios. Quickly going to the third category here of release of non-native mason bees from natural enemies in the introduced range. When I mean this, I'm talking about there are a lot of things, a lot of bad things that can happen to bees and pollinators. And so that there are a lot of ways to be attacked as a bee. And previous studies have found that more non-native bees have been found in bee hotels compared to native bees. And that native bees, though, are attacked more frequently than non-native bees in bee hotels. And we think that's interesting because these studies were conducted in urban landscape contexts. And our guiding questions were, does this same pattern happen in Virginia? And do native mason bees get attacked more than non-native mason bees? In particular, does this unequal attack phenomenon happen in other landscape contexts? So not just urban areas, but perhaps places that are more agricultural or more forested or more natural. So we were able to utilize these years of data for our study, and I utilized I did land cover analyses for all of the sites in those years, where I took a swath of an area that matched the foraging radius of how far these mason bees fly, and I was able to see from this data set what kind of land cover they had. And just as a first result, the answer, if you place a bee hotel out in Virginia in the springtime, you're probably not going to get native mason bees. You're basically going to only get non-native mason bees. So 88 sites, so over 80% of our sites had only non-native mason bees. Another important thing is that the parasitism by wasps was very important to think about here, because it mattered. So first I want to show you the proportion of natural land cover on the horizontal axis. So this is proportion of natural land cover. So that goes from 0 to 1. So 1, you've got very forested areas, whereas at 0, you have more urban development or pasture, cultivated crops, agriculture. And what we found was that our native mason bees are attacked more frequently than non-native mason bees in areas with less natural land cover. So in those urban or agricultural scenarios, but in more forested areas and in more natural areas, this pattern disappears. So we find that super interesting that this is happening. In particular, that first, bee hotels are promoting non-native mason bees. And when you put bee hotels out, that is what you get, is a promotion of non-native mason bees. So native mason bees also are attacked in bee hotels more than non-native species, especially in suburban, urban, or agriculturally intensive areas. And this is a really important sticking point. If there's anything else I talk about, I want y'all to know that bee hotels are really cool. I love looking outside at my bee hotel and seeing what bees go in and out. That's a great informative educational opportunity that you have right out of your kitchen window. But when we talk about them as conservation tools, they may not be positive conservation tools for native springtime mason bee species. So making sure that we understand that is really important. And we could always do more research too to look at other bee groups. And the last thing I want to touch on is the co-introduction of diseases with mason bee species and how they may spill over to native mason bee species. So when we go back to those 4 drivers of bee decline and stressors of bee populations, when a species is introduced into a new environment, it usually doesn't come alone. In fact, it could bring a lot of other associates such as bacteria, viruses, fungi, or other things with it that may or may not be harmful for that non-native species. But those things could expand their host range to the native species that it's newly introduced to. And a disease that really impacts a variety of bee species, both honeybees, so social bees and solitary bees, is chalk brood. So chalk brood is caused by a fungus, by fungi in the genus Ascosphaera. And Ascosphaera impact these bees in a way I'll describe in a few slides. But importantly, there have been researchers that documented a species originally described in Japan, Ascosphaera naganensis. It most likely came over with Osmia cornifrons introduction in the 70s. And this is important because they documented it in Osmia cornifrons, non-native Osmia cornifrons in upstate New York. And what I'm curious about is, have any species of Ascosphaera described from Japan, have they spread into our native mason bee species? So a way that you might pick up these fungal spores, if you're outside and you're a female mason bee, you could pick them up through flowers, water sources, looking at old nests, which is common. So this is important because these fungal spores can exist in the environment for up to 20 years and stay viable. So if I were to draw a cartoon of what a nest looks like, of a mason bee nest, and there are some pollen loaves or provisions that are containing chalk brood fungal spores, and those larvae hatch, they'll consume that pollen provision. But if they're pathogenic fungi, then those larvae are not going to make it to adulthood. They create these mummified looking fuzzy white chalky cadavers, and the siblings that do make it to adulthood will unfortunately may have to chew their way through the detritus of their mummified siblings, and then in effect they will spread all those spores out into the environment. Again, it's keeping the process going. So it's a pretty nasty cycle. And the way I wanted to look at this was to screen a lot of the bee hotel contents that we collected through those sites. And the way we did this was working with a number of wonderful UVA undergraduates at University of Virginia. And we did sterile extraction of these nest contents. And I was able to collaborate with a lab at Cornell University with Brian Danforth, particularly with Aaron Krachilski. And we conducted PCR, DNA extraction, PCR for Ascosphaera, and then sequencing what we got. So what we found is, with all of the nests that we screened, over 70% of all of our nest contents were Osmia cornifrons or Osmia taurus, so the non-native species. And this is representative of what we found in the bee hotels. And this is from 2017 data. But what was very interesting with molecular detection, we were able to see that native Osmia georgica has a very high level of non-native Ascosphaera detection. So at a rate of nearly 50% of the specimens that we screened. And this is very interesting also, is that we found Ascosphaera species described in Japan. They are all over Virginia, and there are 3 species in particular. And they are also in our native mason bees. So Ascosphaera naganensis that was described in Japan, it is primarily found in our native Osmia georgica. It is found most strongly in native Osmia georgica, but it's also found in Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard bee too. Ascosphaera fusiformis, another species described in Japan, is found primarily in Osmia taurus and Osmia cornifrons, but it's also found in our native Osmia georgica and Osmia lignaria. So we think this is super interesting because there is confirmation that these non-native fungi are in fact found in our native mason bees. And they're sometimes strongly associated there with our native mason bee species in Virginia. Really important further work is to evaluate how harmful these fungi are. So not all fungi in this genus are harmful to a given bee. They may be harmful to different species. Figuring out how harmful they are to each species in particular would be super important, as well as co-infections. So how often do we find species together, different fungal species together? And there are a lot of opportunities for understanding fungal diversity. We haven't studied it enough to understand the diversity of these fungal species. So these are the four drivers of these population trajectories I've described. And just to review the key takeaways here are that native mason bee species are declining, while Osmiotaurus is invasively proliferating. Second is Osmiotaurus isn't limited by the same climatic factors that have limited the previously introduced Osmiocornifrons. Third is that bee hotels aren't good conservation tools for native mason bees necessarily, because they increase non-native mason bee proliferation, and native mason bees are attacked more than non-native mason bee species, especially in urban and developed and agriculturally intensive locales. Another important thing is they're still interesting to look at and observe and be educated about. But when we're talking about them as conservation tools, they may not be the most helpful thing. And the last thing that I worked on is that species of fungi originally described from Japan, they are now strongly associated with native mason bee nests in Virginia. And the most important part is we wouldn't know any of this without community science monitoring programs. So there are so many people that made all this work possible, and it takes a village to understand what our bees and our pollinators are going through. Just some brief acknowledgements here, and then I'd love to talk more and answer questions and hear from y'all, is that my research has taken place primarily on the land of the Monacan Indian Nation in Manahoac ancestral lands. Since Spanish invasion, they have introduced famine, shrinking access to their ancestral lands due to English expansion, being forced to purchase land that they have always lived on with a foreign monetary system, and erasure of culture effectively. The Monacan Nation is raising awareness to protect their historical capital and sacred burial grounds, Rosawek. The James River Water Authority is proposing to build a pump station at Rosawek to deliver water to a nearby area slated for economic development. So please visit this website to see how you can support the Monacan Nation in protecting this historic site. Lastly, I've got to go back to all of the community scientists that made this possible. I drove up every one of their driveways, got to meet them and their cats and their grandbabies and their dogs. And I feel like I have a bunch of aunts and uncles and grandparents that I didn't have before. So they're very wonderful people to interact with. And importantly, it's sharing back that data with them is a priority of mine. I also did this with a number of really great undergraduate students that have a lot of different interests and excitement. So if you're a student in this audience, you don't have to be the bee researcher. You can still want to go to medical school, but you can still be part of like a fun research at a university and still learn about bees. And I just want to acknowledge all the rest of these people and my funding. And at this point, I'm happy to take any questions y'all have.
All right. Thank you. That was a great talk. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you. It was fascinating. I am going to open up, I have some questions, but I'm going to open up questions to folks in the audience. You can ask them in the chat if you like, or if they're I think the population in the room is appropriate for people unmuting themselves or going on video if you choose. Just pulling up my chat. Okay.
I'm happy to answer any questions y'all have. I do want to make just one more quick plug for if you've purchased mason bees online, a lot of those mason bees you may purchase are non-native species like Osmia cornifrons. And if you want to purchase mason bees online, I encourage you to reach out to the distributors, personally send them an email or call them up and ask if they are able to identify Osmia taurus, the invasive species, and make sure they're not shipping you that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important point. Yeah, because there are a lot of companies now that do sell those bees to residents. Okay, so we do have a couple questions in the chat. Someone asked, when bees are attacked, is that by other bees? So what are they being attacked by?
Yes. Oh, thank you for asking that clarifying question. What's important there in our research is that we were looking at attacks were by parasitic wasps. So parasitic wasps may enter in that nest when the female bee is away. Another wasp can come in, like a cuckoo wasp right here. It's a jewel green. They're beautiful. Or a Monodontomerus, which has a very long ovipositor here, the second one, or a sapigid wasp. So they do these really cool things where they lay their own eggs inside the cell of the bee, and they either kill the eggs that they lay, will either hatch, and they might eat the bee larva, or they may eat like all of its food and leave the bee larva to starve. But that's the kind of attack rate I was talking about. So thank you for asking that clarifying question.
And related to another question related to that topic, do you have thoughts about why there are fewer attacks with forested areas?
Yes. So I was thinking about this a lot, and I think that there's some conflicting research about wasp populations or parasitic wasp populations in more developed areas versus more forested areas, and if that tracks with mason bee populations as well. And I think the important part there is that there may just be there are a lot of non-native mason bee species in developed areas, and maybe they collectively attract more parasitic wasps to the bee hotel to attack native bees. So the idea is that maybe these parasitic wasps don't recognize the non-native bees as enemies, so they attack the native species significantly more frequently than the non-native species.
Interesting. It's very interesting. Let's see. Someone also, there are two questions here. I'll go to Susan's question. It says, what about mason bees here in Massachusetts, which was related to a question that I had. Do we know sort of what the northern, limit of the Osmia taurus distribution is? So that's the not the one that was purposefully introduced, but the one that may have been accidentally introduced. Do we know how far north that goes?
Yeah, this is a great question, asking about mason bees in Massachusetts. I know that it would be easy to look up if Osmia taurus has made it to Massachusetts. I think it has, but the rate of its proliferation, I don't know if anyone knows. So we should find that out, and we should document if there are changes or not. But I know there are great researchers in Massachusetts that would know more about mason bee diversity. But one of my next steps is to develop some type of species distribution model to model how far Osmia taurus can go north or south. So it's not as common though in places such as upstate New York. And it makes me curious whether it's also more rare in Massachusetts. But would that change with time as time goes by? I'm not sure if that will be the same or if it will proliferate there. So we just need more monitoring.
Yes, we need more citizen science in Massachusetts.
Yes.
Let's see. And then we also had a question. Oh, if you if you purchase native mason bees, where should they be released and where is the best place to purchase them? Is anyone actually rearing native mason bees?
That's an interesting question. One of the native mason bees, some people will claim they're selling native mason bees online, and it may be native to the region in which they're selling from, and not necessarily to where you're buying. So be careful to check that, because they may not check for you. And then the other important thing is some people will sell Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard bee, which is native, but there are two different types of these, and they're genetically different to where they may be mailing them. So the best answer is not to purchase them, but to set up a bee hotel for your for your informal education, just to learn. And when you set it up, they will come. And the important caveat there is to cycle out your native bee hotel, cycle out your bee hotels. So one of the big parts is after a few years, they'll start to build up lots of disease and really enemy attacks. So it's good to not use your bee hotel for more than a couple of years, because after a few years, it's like a honeymoon period, and then it just gets really nasty, like a bastion of disease and terror. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would recommend if you want to look at mason bees in your backyard.
I actually had a related question to that. Do you have evidence? I mean, it seems likely. Do you have evidence that that pathogens are basically being passed from invasive species to native species through the hotels specifically? Is that happening, do you think?
That's such a good question, and I want to really document that mechanism. And I have been working on developing a protocol to test that, but at the moment, I haven't been able to see any research that shows, source transmission, non-native to native. So that right now I've got patterns, which I'm excited about, but I'd love to go into direct mechanism.
So it's possible, but not conclusive.
Still more work to do, as always.
Yes, as always. And then Holly is asking, are there any good reasons to bring in any non-native bees?
This is a great question, Holly. One thing is there are a lot of bee species that we have that are non-native, and some of them come by accident, some of them are intentionally introduced, and some of them that are non-native are culturally important to our society, such as honeybees. The European honeybee is non-native, but I would say that there are really good cultural importance for honeybee keeping. So when it comes to more non-native mason bees for pollination services, I would say don't do that because we aren't able to assess the impacts they will have on their native mason bee species or native bee species, and we've yet to really figure out how the non-native European honeybee in wild areas impacts the native bee fauna. But I think we shouldn't introduce any more, and we should really work hard to evaluate when they are introduced, how are they impacting our native mason bee communities.
Absolutely. Okay, we have I think these are two new questions. Are the bamboo hotels the same thing? That is anything that hosts bees that you can buy a bee hotel?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of bee hotels on the market these days, and some of them are not as helpful or good or going to be helpful than others. If you want mason bees, if you're buying the ones at Lowe's or Costco that are like the size of like a large size, there's not going to be anything like any mason bee that will nest beyond, that at that size. So I think sometimes the hotels that you buy will not be biologically relevant. Like you kind of want to make sure and watch out for certain sizes. I think we need to make a handout, Rosemary, of like the good sizes to study mason bees for the holes. But yeah, some people use bamboo hotels to set them up. Other folks use wood or paper straws or cardboard. So there's a variety of different things that you can use.
Do you know, I mean, I don't know if you may not have tested this, so maybe it's not known. Do those different materials potentially attract different kinds of mason bees?
That's a great question. And I think that could be part of it. More important, or maybe also importantly, sometimes they're more conducive to disease developing. Yeah. So I believe if you put plastic straws out and made a nest, you get a really bad humidity issue and the mason bees will die inside of them. And with wood, you can get mites that just take over after a couple of years, after the honeymoon period, after a couple of years, the mites will build up. And I didn't talk about mites, but they really can attack mason bees after a while when they build up in there in chalk brood.
Yeah. And then is there anything that we can do to help the native bees? Do they prefer certain plants, for example?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think the best things we can do for protection is educating other people about native bees, having a conversation with other people about native bees, raising awareness, learning more about them is the first big step. You can definitely create pollinator friendly gardens that offer lots of good bee food resources over an extended amount of time that are complementary for other co-flowering species. That is great. I also think just having those conversations and calling your representatives when necessary to such in government and local and federal government to talk about these issues. Those are like the best ways you can do it. So even if you don't have like a big, large acre pollinator garden, even if you've just got your apartment room, like calling your senators and your local government is really important. And talking about native bees is also just as important.
Awesome. Let's see. Do they prefer certain native plants? The first question is about identification. Well, let's stick with the nesting actually, and then I'll come back to that one. Is it reasonable? So Elizabeth is asking, is it reasonable to use the dried stems of last year's milkweed or other native plants and change these yearly for AB hotels? I'm assuming taking that material and then sticking it in like a hotel box.
That could be cool, especially if they're hollow, making sure they're super hollow. I think if you build it or put it out there, they may come. And it's kind of an experiment for yourself. That's the awesome part of like doing this type of informal education is say, okay, when I put these out, my advisor and Rosemary's former advisor, Ty, he has this amazing thing in his backyard where he's just testing out different types of hollow cavities and seeing if they're going to nest in there. So I recommend trying it all out and seeing what happens, and changing those yearly could be a great idea.
And also to that point, I mean, we talked about native plants being important for native bees, but you can also create nesting habitat in your yard by doing exactly that, which is to not, clear away all the dead material at the end of the season, which leaves sort of these natural cavities for them to occupy. That's great. Let's see. And then I think I skipped over one. Are there distinguishing marks that can aid in the quick identification of the two non-native mason bees?
Yes, that's a great question. One important thing is that if you're trying to tell if you've got a native or non-native mason bee, that's one thing. If you're trying to tell apart between the two non-native mason bees, so Osmia taurus and Osmia cornfrons, that is actually really difficult. And you have to use a microscope to check under a certain portion of their body. But basically, these two here, the non-native mason bees are more brown, yellow, fuzzy, and most of the rest of the native mason bee species we have here, they're more metallic green or black and yellow. But these two are more orange, brownish in their coloration. But these two you have to tell apart with a microscope, unfortunately. So but if you ever get interested, I'm happy. I've had people mail them to me and my email address is over here, and I'm happy to check under a microscope for you if you're particularly interested and think you have a non-native mason bee species. So here's my email address. It's masonbeemonitoring@gmail.com.
That's easy to remember. Okay, I think we're coming up on 8 o'clock, which is the end of our presentation. I will say there's one more question in the chat. I'm not sure I understand, because I think this came in response to something that we were talking about, but it seems like maybe the question is, are there ways that we can inadvertently harm native mason bees?
Yeah, I think putting out a bee hotel and forgetting about it for 8 years, that's one one-way ticket to building up fungus and mites and creating like a haunted house for native mason bees to nest in and not realize that it's a bad deal. So I think that's one way we can inadvertently harm native mason bees. That's a good question.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone who came out tonight. I'm so glad you were here, and such great questions. Thank you so much for a really excellent first seminar. Thank you so much. And Kate, thank you so much for being here. Yes. I enjoyed your talk.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thank y'all so much.
Yeah. And to everyone on the call, we will be sending out information about our July speaker. We're still trying to firm up some details, but probably toward the end of July, we'll be hosting our second speaker in the series. So thank you, Kate, and thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.
Stop.